Hello again, my little bamboo spear fighters, and welcome to another Mordian Glory video. Today's episode is going to be a tournament after action report. That's right, it's time for some more dispatches from the front lines. And oh boy, do I have a spicy meatball for your viewing pleasure today, because I took what is considered by many to be the worst major faction in bolt action to a tournament. My Imperial Japanese army has been thrust into the competitive meta. And you know what? It didn't go as badly as I thought it would. And so without further ado, and with a little bit of foreshadowing, let's banzai and charge right into this thing. You there, guardsmen! Do you like multi-part plastic sci-fi infantry that doesn't cost a kidney? Well, good news! The Mordian Glory channel is now officially sponsored by Wargames Atlantic. Wargames Atlantic sells fantastic sci-fi models which are perfect as alternative Imperial guardsmen. This includes the Bulldogs, totally not Praetorians, or the Grognards, which are totally not Mordians, Vestorians, or Kriegers, all in one box. And the best bit is, Wargames Atlantic offers a bulk buy discount, and the more you buy, the bigger the discount. Perfect for amassing those huge platoons of guardsmen. So what are you waiting, you fool? Click on the affiliate link down below, get yourself some great models, and support the channel today. As is tradition, I want to start off with a few thank yous. Firstly, I want to say a big thank you to Warlord Games themselves for organising and hosting this bolt action tournament. This was my first time going to a Warlord event, and it was really good. The boards were fantastic, everything was well organised, and we got a fantastic lunch, which is always a big bonus. It was a real pleasure and a treat to play several games in one day at the heart of bolt action. I also want to say a big thank you to all of my opponents for 3 fantastic games. Tabletop gaming really is a social hobby, and whether you have a good event or a bad one really comes down to the people that you play against, and I can confidently say that all of my games were just fantastic. But with that said, now let's get into the video proper, and we'll start off with the list overview. As is tradition, I have made a separate video deep diving the army list, really getting into the nitty-gritty detail, and I'll make sure there's a link to that video down in the description below. But of course, I'll give you guys a quick summary now. My list was essentially my 2nd edition Japanese army list, which I was just taking for a spin in 3rd edition. I haven't had as much time to update my Japanese as I had for my other factions, but it's one of the armies that has been most requested by the MG bolt action community. So I thought, you know what, I just won't worry about it too much. I'll take them and we'll just have a bit of fun with them. So in my army list, I had 1 rifle platoon led by a regular officer, and then I had 3 big squads of Japanese infantry. I had 2 squads of 14 and 1 squad of 13. These were all regular veterancy. To finish off the rifle platoon, I had 2 of the 1-pop anti-tank teams. You know the ones. It's where the infantry run into the side of the vehicle and they detonate. These guys were taken as inexperienced because I needed to save a few points, and also I don't really think you can be a veteran at that job. Rounding out the army, I had 2 more platoons. I had a heavy weapons platoon with a regular officer, a regular medium machine gun, and a regular mortar with a spotter. And then I had an artillery platoon with a medium anti-tank gun, a light howitzer, and a regular officer. Pretty much everything in the army was regular veterancy apart from those anti-tank guys. Overall, the army was a pure infantry force, but that was because the tournament was 750 points, and I tried squeezing vehicles in, but even with how cheap the Japanese armor is, I just couldn't quite get everything that I wanted. So I thought it was better to whole-ass a couple of things rather than half-ass multiple things. And I was pretty happy with what I'd managed to achieve with the 750 points. We had a solid infantry corps, we had just enough anti-tank between the medium AT and the anti-tank teams, and we also had a respectable amount of HE with the medium mortar and the light howitzer. It's a list which has got a lot of tools in the toolbox, and hopefully it was going to be able to handle multiple battlefield situations. But I guess we'll just have to find out later on how this list did. Before we do, let's take a look at the lay of the land. So what was this tournament all about? What was the format? How competitive was it? What was the terrain like? For the format, it was a 1-day, 3-round tournament with each round being 2 hours long. That does sound quite short for round times, but you've got to remember we are playing 750 points, so we don't necessarily need the full 3.5 hour rounds that you might expect with some larger events. As for the competitiveness, it was surprisingly competitive. There were a lot of previous tournament winners and very experienced players at the event. There was also a few people that were clearly just sort of coming down for their first sort of rodeo of Bolt Action 3rd edition. So there was a good spread, but overall, I would say this was solidly competitive. And as for the terrain, it was beautiful. I mean, we're playing Bolt Action in the heart of Warlord Games. They have got loads of really good tables, and some of them are battle mats, but some of them are the old school, more tactile ones. And it wasn't necessarily perfectly balanced. There was no like standard terrain maps or anything like that, but it was really, really immersive. The terrain was flavor first, balance second. But you know what? I think that covers enough pre-game, preamble, if you will. I know why you're all really here. Let's get into the games. So game number 1, and I end up getting paired into the man, the myth, the foil, Chapter Master Valrak. This was a full-blown grudge match. I called out Valrak and was like, me and you, first round, let's make this happen. And that's because this so-called Chapter Master doesn't even play Warhammer anymore. Has been telling everyone that he's the undefeated Bolt Action champion, that no one can beat him. And I was like, you know what? It's time to put this Emperor's second finest in his place. Jokes and memes aside, this is actually a really chill, really fun game. And it turns out that Mr. Valrak has the same penchant for movie quotes and TV quotes that I do. And so pretty much the entire time we were communicating in scenes from Band of Brothers, from Saving Private Ryan, and even a bit of We Were Soldiers. If Chapter Master Valrak is watching this, you call that son of a bitch off! He'll get it. He'll get it. But getting back to the game, what was Valrak running? He had his American Airborne Army. Now, off the top of my head, his list included 3 squads of infantry. 2 of them had rifles and 1 of them had SMGs. We also had 2 heavy machine guns, and there was a light mortar and a medium mortar in the list as well. I think there were a couple of bazooka teams running around, there were a couple of inexperienced officers, and also there was an air observer. The mission that we were playing was kill points. Basically, you get 1 point for each unit that you kill, and you have to win the game by at least 2 kill points. So, for example, if I've got 2 kills and Valrak has 0, then I would win the game. But if I get 2 kills and Valrak gets 1 kill, even though I'm ahead because I'm not ahead by 2 points, that would still count as a draw. Deployment was the long table edges, and I put a unit of Japanese infantry with an officer on the right flank. In the center, I had another big unit of Japanese infantry with an officer and an MMG team. And then over on the left flank, I had my light howitzer, my mortar, my spotter, my medium tank gun, and another big unit of infantry with an officer. I did have my 2 anti-tank guys, but they weren't going to do anything this game as Valrak didn't have any vehicles, so I sort of just kept them safely ensconced at the back behind the forest, just making sure I didn't give up their kill points. For the Americans, they went for a bit more forced concentration. From the Japanese perspective, there was basically nothing over on the left flank. In the middle, there was a unit of infantry and a bazooka team, an officer and a light mortar and the observer. And then over on the right flank was everything else. With all of the units deployed, it was time to get the dice in the bag and start activating units. Now, rather than going through each activation that happened, which might get a little bit confusing because some things were activated on the left and then on the right and then in the middle, what I'm going to do, guys, is break the action down by flanks. So we'll talk about the left, middle and right, and we'll talk about the important things that happened each turn in those sectors. So turn 1 on the left flank, I move forward with my Japanese rifle squad, and I'm able to pour firepower into the American air observer, and I am able to kill the extra man with the observer. In the middle, my machine gun team manages to draw line of sight and get range on the air observer as well, and it manages to kill him. So straight away we've taken a dice out of the bag, and more importantly, we've killed that air observer before he's even had a chance to call in a single airstrike. That covers the main bits that happened on the left and the middle. The rest of it really is just units sort of pushing forward and shuffling around, but there wasn't much else that was in range. As for the right flank, well, that started popping off in a big way. My Japanese infantry unit moved forward into the forest, tried to get a few shots off, but really didn't achieve very much. And for its trouble, it really just exposed itself to a lot of American firepower. And my right-hand side squad definitely started taking some heavy casualties early on. And the Americans were pushing up very aggressively on that flank as well. The only saving grace for the Japanese on the right flank was the fact that my mortar got that lucky turn 1-6 and managed to dial in and annihilate one of the 2 American heavy machine gun teams. With a rapid fire turn 1 in the bag, it was time to go straight into turn 2. On the left flank, the Japanese infantry squad continued to push forward aggressively. I started laying firepower into the American bazooka team that was worming its way through the woods and was actually able to kill one of the squad members. I also used my medium machine gun over in the middle and poured some firepower into a unit of American veterans that was in the same forest, and I got kind of lucky and was able to kill 2 or 3 of them in one burst. But this time, the Americans were in range to fire back, and my medium machine gun team did start taking some pins, although thankfully not many casualties at this point. It's definitely becoming apparent that the Americans are struggling on the left and the middle, but they are dominating over on that right side. An effective use of combined arms warfare and with a really cheeky snap 2 sees the Americans essentially close the distance, but not quite getting into point blank range with my Japanese infantry squad, who spends pretty much the entire turn hunkering down, whilst machine guns and mortars and rifles and SMGs continue to pour fire into the squad, whittling it down to about half strength. We get into turn 3 and the Americans realize that continuing to push forward in the middle is just going to result in needless casualties. At some point in turn 2, the bazooka team had also been killed, so they've lost 2 dice on that flank already, and if they stick around, there's a chance they're going to lose more. So in turn 3, they fall back with one of the infantry squads first, and they start moving away with the mortar as well. Sadly, before he has a chance to activate, the officer that was over there does get sniped by some Japanese machine gun fire, getting the Japanese another dice in the bag. This is giving us a 3 dice lead at the moment, which is pretty hefty, but we're going to struggle to get anything more out of that mid. But before the Banzai boys can gloat too much, the American right flank goes absolutely ham. With fire support from the heavy machine gun and a mortar that's dialed in, my Japanese squad is reduced down to about 4 or 5 survivors, and then a snap 2 goes off and a unit of riflemen provide covering fire, and then a unit of airborne go into combat. It's about 4 Japanese versus 6 airborne, and they've got SMGs and we don't. And after the rough and tumble of close combat, we see 3 of the airborne killed, but all of the Japanese wiped out. We have just been beaten in combat. To quote Shogun Total War, a shameful display! But it's not over yet. My Japanese officer, in an attempt to regain honor for his men, charges forward into the US airborne and doesn't kill them, and then gets killed. So I actually lose 2 dice. So now we're looking at 3 dice to 2 dice. And suddenly this game has gone from a comfy Japanese lead to very much a draw. To quote Shogun Total War, a shameful display. But it wasn't over yet. My officer, in an attempt to regain some honor for his men, charges into the remnants of the airborne unit, manages to kill one of them, but unfortunately is cut down by their close combat attacks. And we get to the end of turn 3, And it's actually 4 dice to the Japanese and 2 dice to the Americans, because the Japanese have got the air observer, the bazooka team, the heavy machine gun team, and we also got the inexperienced officer, but the Americans have just got one of my officers, and they've taken out one of my big squads as well. And unfortunately for the Americans, they kind of blew their load. A lot of effort had been expended on clearing out that right flank, and to be fair, they did completely control it, but they'd taken some heavy casualties. The veterans SMGs were kind of knackered, and then the rifleman squad was really the only intact infantry unit that they had left. They were retreating in the middle with the remnants of one of their other units and with the mortar. And so over the course of turn 4, turn 5, and turn 6, it kind of saw both armies protecting their weaker units. I moved my machine gun team and my mortar, my howitzer, my officers. I just made sure those were all sort of hidden out of line of sight, that the Americans weren't going to pick them up. And there was just a bit of an extended firefight between my big blob of infantry that was in the middle of the board, kind of screening and just running interference against the shattered remnants of the Americans. But I wasn't able to pick up any extra dice from them, and they weren't able to pick up any extra dice from me. So kind of all the action happened in the first half of the game, and the second half of the game saw a bit of fighting and generally just unit preservation happening on both sides. And so at the end of the game, it was 4 dice to 2 in favor of the Japanese. But I just want to say a big shout out to Varrett, because I do think that the tactics he displayed over on that right flank were actually really good. The combination of using the snap 2s and the covering fire from the machine guns, making sure he's keeping my Japanese heads down, he completely dominated that right flank, and he did it through good tactics. And considering he's not been playing the game very long, I do think that is worthy of a shout out. However, I also think that he is an absolute coward and an utter disgrace of a man, because he ran away! He ran away with so many of his units. He started this whole unit preservation thing first. And so I am not only claiming the actual victory, I am claiming the moral victory as well. And with that beef sizzling away on the pan, let's go into game number 2. But no rest for the wicked, and we're going to go straight into game number 2. And this time, the Japanese found themselves in their native environment, stalking through the jungles of the Pacific. But before things could get too historical, it turns out that we were fighting against some renegade German forces. Who knows how they got there? Perhaps they were some turncoats, or maybe it was very, very early war, and we were actually fighting against some Chinese forces which had been equipped with lots of German stuff, which actually did happen. Regardless of how they got there, the German army consisted of 2 small units with an LMG in each one, and then there was a squad of 5 guys which were veterans, but they just had rifles. There were a couple of inexperienced officers running around, and also we had a inexperienced medium machine gun team and a regular heavy mortar with a spotter. There was also a Panzerschreck in the list and 2 vehicles, a Panzer 38T, which is a light tank with a light anti-tank gun and 2 medium machine guns, and then there was the Panzer II Lux, which is the Lynx, I think is what it translates to, and it has the autocannon and the machine guns, and of course it has Recce. The mission for Game 2 was key positions. This is where there are a number of objectives on the board, and whoever controls the most objectives by the end of the game wins. There was also sticky objectives in play, which meant that if you took an objective, it remained yours until your opponent took it back. Now that was really important because it meant that you couldn't try and take the objectives back with vehicles, because vehicles could only contest objectives. They don't actually bring it back under your control. Now, in typical key positions fashion, this always seems to happen. My opponent and I rolled off to pick sides. We started deploying some units, and then we were like, oh, we haven't haven't deployed the objectives. Now, because we were already partway through the 2-hour round, we didn't want to start going back and resetting everything because that would have been a nightmare. So we just had a gentleman's agreement. We rolled to see how many objectives there were. It turned out there were 5. And so we agreed to just put 1 in the middle of each table quarter and 1 in the middle of the map. That meant that each player got 1 in their homeland, and there were essentially 3 strung out across the middle of the map that we could fight over. In all honesty, I kind of wish that key positions was like this anyway. I know some people would say that it makes the game a little bit samey and makes it a little bit like 40k, but to be honest, I found that it made the game really fun and really balanced, and it just meant that we could focus on the fighting and not having to worry about, oh, did I place that objective in the right place or not? It just kept things smoother, and smoother is better. With our little problem resolved, we then finished off our deployment. I ended up with my machine gun team, an anti-tank guy, and a platoon of infantry on the left with my medium anti-tank gun. And then in the middle, I had my mortar, my light howitzer, an officer, and another big squad of infantry. And then over on the right-hand side, I had an anti-tank guy, an officer, and a big blob of infantry. I essentially split my force down into 3 sort of equal parts. As for the Germans, on the right flank, they put an infantry squad with an LMG, an inexperienced MMG, and an officer. In the middle, on their homeland, they had the heavy mortar, and then they also had the Panzer 38T. And I think there was another infantry squad over on that flank as well. It was sort of in the middle on the left, hiding behind the bamboo house. And then over on the left, they had the Lux, they had the veterans, and there was the Panzerschreck and an officer as well. With all of the forces down on the ground, it was time to get the turns rolling. And once again, I'll break things down by left, middle, and right flank. Now, due to the nature of the terrain, there was a lot of dense terrain on this board. The first couple of turns were essentially positional. People were staging, they were moving up, they were worming their way through and around the forest, getting themselves into position. So over on the right flank, my infantry squad and my anti-tank guy and my officer essentially just moved up behind the hill. They got in and around the sort of stone ruin, and they got onto that right objective. In the middle, I pushed forward one of my infantry squads, but just essentially hugged the terrain and didn't poke anybody out. And then over on the left, I moved my infantry forward a little bit, but honestly, I was in no rush to get onto that objective. And for the first turn or two, I was kind of just hiding behind the forest, had my machine gun on ambush, and that was about it. There was only one big thing that happened in turn 1 and turn 2, and that was I managed to get a lucky hit on my opponent's spotter. I think it was turn 2 with my medium mortar or my light howitzer, and I was able to kill it. This meant that my opponent's heavy mortar now didn't have any way of being able to see things, and it spent a lot of the rest of the game moving into position, trying to get line of sight for the later turns. But it wasn't out of the game completely. As you see, it will come back later on. Going into turn 3, things start heating up. On the right flank, my big infantry squad moves on top of the hill and starts pouring fire into one of the German units with a light machine gun. And honestly, these two units basically trade fire back and forth for the rest of the game. You see, despite the fact that my opponent has got a light machine gun and that he's actually causing more casualties, I'm sort of killing one German every other turn. He's sort of reliably killing a Japanese soldier every turn. I've just got so many more bodies than him, and he doesn't really have the mass from that one squad, that one LMG, to push forward and take this objective off me. So honestly, for the right flank, these two units just traded fire the entire game, and the Japanese held that objective and we locked it down. In the middle, things were a little bit dicier. Over the course of turn 3 and turn 4, I push my big infantry blob forward, and I have an officer that's hiding behind them, giving them the +2 leadership, making sure that they're still able to do orders, even though they're getting quite badly lit up. I'm not taking too many casualties. I'm being fairly lucky on my cover saves, but at one point, my unit is up to like 3 or 4 pins, and it's just that I'm just able to keep passing those morale checks thanks to the fact that I've got the officer nearby. Things come to a head in the middle though, over turn 5 and turn 6. It's a very action-packed end to this sector of the board. My infantry squad on turn 5 makes a couple of attempts to banzai charge one of my opponent's officers. Because I'm Japanese, I get to re-roll the charge if I'm in range, re-roll the order test. Now I fail it on turn 5 and I try at the very end of turn 5. It comes to turn 6 and I pull the first dice out the bag. I'm able to get the charge off. It comes down to the very last order test. I'm on 5 pins with an officer nearby. So essentially I'm rolling morale 6 to try and get this order off. The last possible chance I get it off, I charge the officer, I brutally murder him, and I'm able to consolidate onto the objective. But here's the thing. My opponent had got that objective first, which meant that it was under my opponent's control as per the sticky objective rule. So I needed my opponent's unit to go away, to be killed, in order for me to hold that objective. I fire both of my indirect fire units at the enemy German unit that's on that middle objective, and I get 2 6s, one after the other. My opponent can't believe it. I flatten the German unit. It goes from like a 10-man squad down to like a 3-man squad with like 3 or 4 pins on it, and my opponent had to take a morale check at like -3 or 4. He's got to pass on like a 5 or a 6. He rolls the dice, cool as a cucumber, and he passes. It wasn't quite on the double 1. I don't think it was quite that epic, but he comfortably passes on like a 4 or 3, and the German unit holds. As a result, my opponent retains control of that middle objective. So we both control our home objectives. I control the right one. He controls the middle one. It's all going to come down to the left flank. And let me tell you, we have saved the best flank until last. This was a nail-biting back and forth battle between the Japanese fighting under the banner of the rising sun against the veteran Germans and their armoured support. At first, things went well for the Germans. They made it the objective first, they stickied it, they locked it down. And they did some terrible, terrible damage to my machine gun team, essentially knocking it out. It wasn't quite dead, but it didn't do anything for the rest of the game. But then, setback after setback. The Lux pushed forward just a little bit too aggressively. The Japanese seized on this opportunity. Despite the fact it was a fully armoured vehicle, thanks to the fact we had our officer nearby, we were actually able to assault it with our Japanese infantry unit. This got us a bit closer to the objective, but also allowed us to start swarming it. And although we didn't do any damage in the first round of assault, we were just setting ourselves up. Because next turn, the first dice came out of the bag for the Japanese, and we had an anti-tank man right next to the Lux. He'd run up behind the infantry wave that had initially gone in and tried to clamber all over it, and with a shout of "Banzai!" he charged him. Now the Lux did its best to try and recce away, but due to the position of the Japanese infantry that had sort of swarmed it, and the fact that you can't assault as part of recce, he couldn't get far enough away at all from the anti-tank man. And in his efforts to do so, the Lux's rear armor was exposed. A pen plus 10 hit. Plus 8 for the strength of the weapon. Plus 2 for hitting the rear armor. Absolutely obliterated it. We got a double pen. I rolled like a 4, got like a double pen. And then both results were destroyed. It was like a 4 and a 6. There was naught left but tiny bits of flaming shrapnel. And then to make matters worse, to rub salt in the wound, the second dice out of the bag was for the Japanese as well. And we were able to do a banzai charge against the veterans. The veteran infantry holding the objective. We charged them with our big blob of infantry. Sure, they were veterans. Sure, they were going to get to fight first. But they didn't have tough fighter. There was only 5 of them, and I had a full 13, 14-man squad. We lost 2 of our brave Japanese soldiers, but we killed 4 of the veterans, and the last one surrendered. This brought the left-hand objective under the control of the Empire of the Rising Sun, and despite a furious German counterattack from the Panzer 38T and a lucky 6 to hit on the final turn by the heavy mortar, the Japanese just managed to retain control of the objective. And so once the dust had settled, Japanese controlled 3 objectives and the Germans controlled 2. It was a narrow Japanese victory, but I just want to say this was one of the most nail-biting games of bolt action I have ever had. Every single dice roll mattered. Every single dice pulled out of the bag was impactful. It was exactly what bolt action was meant to be. We get to game number 3, and somehow I've got 2 wins under my belt, and somehow I find myself fighting on top table. I really was not expecting this. I've taken my 2nd edition completely unoptimized Japanese list to an event, but hey, I'll take it. And I actually end up playing against my brother. So my brother has his own YouTube channel, Scholar for Genium. Make sure you check it out. He does lots and lots of bolt action content. And we've actually played against each other before at a tournament recently where he resoundingly beat me. So I was hoping to put up a little bit more of a better fight this time. The mission for the final game was Breakthrough, and that's where you've got to try and get units into your opponent's deployment zone, or even better if you can run them off the board. And for deployment, it was long table edges. For my deployment on the left flank, I put a big blob of infantry, an officer, and my 2 anti-tank guys. And in the middle, I put a big blob of infantry and the light howitzer. And then on the right flank, I had a big blob of infantry and my mortar and an officer. And on the far right hand flank, I had my medium anti-tank gun and I had my medium machine gun and an officer. I realized I got a little bit ahead of myself talking about deployment before my opponent's list, so we'll do a 2-for-1 and we'll talk about the list and the deployment at the same time. My brother was running Finnish, and he had on the left flank a unit of CC with an LMG and an officer, and another unit of CC with just rifles. All of the squads are 5-man strong. In the middle, there was another 2 units of CC, one with LMG and one just with rifles, and there was also a Panzerschreck and another officer. On the right flank, there were 2 medium machine gun teams and another Panzerschreck team. Now, my plan throughout this game was to essentially hold the line in the middle and on the right flank, and then push forward really aggressively on the left flank. You see, there's only really like 1 squad of CC and an officer that's facing off against my big blob of infantry. And if my infantry with a bit of artillery support can break through on that left flank, then I'll be able to get my officer, my infantry blob, and 2 anti-tank guys either off the board or into my opponent's deployment zone. That's a lot of units. And if I can just hold everywhere else, I should be able to win the game. With my forces deployed and my plan in place, it's time to get into the game. Over on the right-hand side, the first turn essentially consists of my machine gun getting into a bit of a duel with my opponent's machine guns. I thought I had deployed far enough back where they couldn't target me, but with there being no pre-measuring about action, I had eyeballed it just not quite enough, and the machine guns were in range of me by a whisker, by like half an inch for both of them. Over the course of the first couple of turns on that right flank, my machine gun tried to put up a sterling defense, trying to snipe out the Panzerschreck before it could get too far forward, but it was not to be. And by the end of, I think, turn 2 or beginning of turn 3, my machine gun had been destroyed by the opposing machine gun teams. But I had managed to do a few wounds on one of the LMG teams, thanks to the fact that my medium anti-tank gun was also on that flank, and it clearly had range, and it still puts out a 1-inch blast. And so I was able to badly injure one of the machine gun teams, but really my right flank was a little bit exposed at that point, and I didn't have much that could stop the enemy from starting to push forward on that side. But it's the middle that I have to say I am most proud of. Despite much banter and baiting and calls of cowardice, my Japanese soldiers did not go banzai charging off to inevitable destruction. I held the line. Disciplined rifle fire kept whittling the CC down, taking a casualty off them here, putting a few pins on them there, and they did push forward. And the fact that they can move, they can advance and then shoot or go into ambush, and then if they go into ambush, if you shoot them, they can go down. It makes them really, really durable. So despite the fact that they were sort of creeping towards me, laying down fire, or going down and just being a nightmare, I was actually able to hold against the CC. And CC are all natively like tough fighter. So the fact that my just regular ass Japanese soldiers who didn't have any LMGs or any special rules or anything like that just held good against three squads of veteran CC with the Panzerschreck and officer support. I was actually really, really proud of that. And essentially I just kept pouring the fire on, making sure I was passing my order checks, use my officer support, and I fought the CC to a standstill in the middle of the board, essentially over the first 2 or 3 turns of the game. As for the left flank, it went just as planned. Over the first 2 or 3 turns, I completely clear away the CC squad simply by just using my medium mortar and my light howitzer. I was able to dial in early on with my mortar and just blow up those CC, just getting rid of them, even with them going down. And over the first 2 or 3 turns, my infantry squad, my officer, and my anti-tank guys make it across the river, and they get up to the ruined farmhouse, and we've got a straight shot down the road. All we need to do is run down the road for the next 2 or 3 turns, and we should be able to get all of those units off the board, and there's not much that the Finns can really do to stop us. However, things don't go perfectly. Turn 4 on the right flank sees the Finns able to run a Panzerschreck off the board. I just needed the first dice and I could have stopped that. I did have the dice advantage. It was about, I think, 12 dice to 8 dice at this point, but sometimes that's the way the cookie crumbles, and they were able to run off the Panzerschreck team and get themselves 3 points in the bank. Also, over the course of turn 4 and turn 5 on the right flank, they run forward with a medium machine gun team and they run forward with a Panzerschreck team. They don't quite get into my deployment zone, but they're getting close. In the middle, we have got the Finns on the ropes. They do a desperate charge against one of my Japanese infantry squads. My infantry squad is actually on the hill. It's not on the flat ground, it's sort of on the hill. And I do argue that I should get to strike first because hills do count as defender positions. But my opponent says that I'm not behind a barricade, so it doesn't count. We fight at the same time. We're getting a little close on time. There's not much time left, so I don't really have the luxury of being able to sort of pull the rulebook out and argue my case. So we just roll it out, and what ends up happening is we both completely wipe each other out to a man. I don't really mind that result because the CC unit doing that charge was a desperate attempt to get into my deployment zone, and I had managed to stop that, which denied my opponent the victory point, so I was happy with that result anyway. The final unit of CC runs forward, or should I say advances forward, and they don't get into my deployment zone, and they try and do a point-blank volley into my Japanese infantry unit behind the wall in the dead center, but they don't really achieve anything because it's 5 guys with rifles, even with point blank range. They're hitting on 3s, and then they're wounding on 4s, and then I've got a 4+ save. I think I take a casualty and a pin, just not much to worry about. We then go over to the left flank. Over the course of turn 4 and turn 5, I pound my infantry down the road, and I'm able to get my big infantry squad into my opponent's deployment zone. And I've got one of my anti-tank guys and my officer I thought they'd made it in deployment zone, but I don't think they quite managed it. I think I just threw them forward. I should have been a bit more careful with my movement, to be fair. I sort of said, okay, they can make it into the deployment zone. So I just pushed them forward, and the last anti-tank guy didn't quite make it because my opponent charged his officer into my anti-tank guy. Even though it knew it would mean its officer died, which it did, it meant that it denied me another unit potentially getting off the board or getting into deployment zone next turn. We're about to go into get turn number 6, and the TOs shout, "Time! Dice down." Now, I just need to do literally 1 dice at the beginning of turn 6, because it doesn't matter what dice it is, I can just pull 1 dice, I can do a snap 2, I can get my infantry squad off the table, I can get my anti-tank guy and my officer into my opponent's deployment zone, and that will get me a total of 5 victory points. So I say, okay, well, I just need to do 1 more dice to make that happen, but my opponent says, well, it's time, it's hard dice down. And I'm like, okay, well, it is only a quick thing, and it does make a big difference, so we're going to have to get the TO over, because obviously we haven't quite got to turn 6, but my turn 6 is literally going to consist of this 1 maneuver. I call the TO over, and I explain the situation, saying that if we have 1 more turn, it would mean that I'd be able to get my unit off the board, we'd get to the end of the game, I'd get 5 points, and then my opponent would also have 5 points. He has 1 unit off the board, and he could have 2 units that get into my deployment zone over on the right flank. But then essentially it means that it would come down to kill points, and because I've killed 5 units to my opponent's like 2 or 3 units, it would mean it was a win. So I say, are we able to do the last turn, because that would make a big difference to the game, or are we just doing a hard dice down exactly where we are? And the TO says, without missing a beat, it's hard dice down at this event, guys. Whatever the result is now, that's the result you're gonna have to go with. I'm not going to lie, I was a little bit disappointed, which I think is only natural, because you could see victory was in my grasp. I would have had 5 victory points to 5 victory points, and I would have won on kills. But I also totally respect the TO's decision, and they were very, very consistent. Every single round up until this point had been hard dice down. I spoke to one of my mates, Alex, and he said they always do hard dice down at Warlord events. No matter what it is, that's just what they do. And so I totally respect the decision, and I totally understand it. And I actually think it might have been a little unfair if they'd made an exception for me. If they have hard dice down, they have hard dice down. And that's something that I know going forward for Warlord tournaments. So unfortunately, due to simply running out of time, we were not able to do turn 6, and this meant that the final score ended with 3 points to the Finnish because they got their Panzerschreck team off, and 1 point to the Japanese because we had our infantry squad in their deployment zone. This meant that sadly I went from potentially winning the entire event, Johnny did end up winning the tournament in the end, to dropping down to 4th, so I didn't even get on the podium. Shame. But these things happen, and at the end of the day, I still had a fantastic event, and I still enjoyed all 3 of my games. And let's be real here for a minute. I've done far better than I expected. No one else there was running Japanese. I think a lot of people have written the faction off. And what I found was that they're still totally viable and still really powerful. Having army-wide Fnatic is fantastic. And I managed to go 2-1 with what a lot of people are saying is arguably the worst faction in the game. And I was able to console my damaged soul with some victory chicken, and I also bought the new Ostwind model for my German army. But that's all from me. Let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. How would you improve my Japanese army, and what would you add to it if you wanted to get it up to 1,250 points? Don't forget to like the video, guys. It really does help it with the YouTube algorithm, and also subscribe to never miss an episode. Would you like to know more? If so, then please consider becoming a channel member or patron. By supporting the channel, not only will you be doing your part, but you'll also be helping me create more content for your viewing pleasure and unlocking a whole host of perks. You get everything from a badge next to your name, custom emojis, but the big one is access to the Mordian Glory Discord server, an online community with almost 2,500 active members. It's always popping off in the MG Discord. We've got channels for army lists, hobbying, tactics, stories, and even a pretty spicy meme section as well. For all you greenhorns that wanted to see the Mordian glory hole, today is your lucky day. And joking aside, I do want to say a massive thank you to all of the current channel members and patrons. You guys are amazing. Truly the lifeblood of the channel. I could not do Mordian Glory full-time without the incredible and generous support of my members. So thank you guys so much. And last but certainly not least, I want to say a personal thank you to all of my top tier Patreons. These are the War Masters, the people who have truly gone above and beyond the call of duty. So a heartfelt thank you to Alex Dengal, Bon Vert, Lord Pryor, Mark Panconi, RJ Scorpion, Swordfish Trombone, Try Again Bragg, John Stubbs, Nick Walsh, Diesel Fox, and August Barney. Seriously, guys, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Your support is incredible and it makes a huge difference. Thank you so much. That's all for now. Hope you've all enjoyed today's video. And of course, as always, I'll see you guys next time.